Hello, my name is David Higgins and I'm a lecturer in English Literature at the University of Leeds. The topic of this lecture is John Clare, Identity and Place. Although I teach in a range of areas, my research specialism is the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. At university, most, if not all of your tutors would be active researchers and publishers in their specialism. Sometimes I think students worry that research distracts academics from the business of teaching. But ideally, at least, it shouldn't be like that. In my view, academics who are involved in cutting-edge research and are themselves undergoing a process of intellectual discovery are best able to challenge and stimulate students and to help students themselves become active, engaged researchers. Being a researcher is about being intellectually curious and flexible, and this is a quality often wanted by employers. The relationship between research and teaching is a complex one. I think in some respects the sort of research I do informs all my teaching, even when it's of text that I've never written on. But this podcast is on an author who's central to my current research, and as it happens, last week I was visiting Peterborough to look at material in some of John Clare's archives, and it was really interesting to see work that it was actually written in his own handwriting. For a long time I've been fascinated by the way in which literature seeks to explore and represent the self. My current research focuses on autobiographical writing during the Romantic period, that is, writing about the individual self. And I'm interested in how such writing seeks to position the self within individual places and spaces. So that might be something very specific, like a particular village or region, or something more broad, like a national community, like England or Britain. So I'm interested in how texts plot out a sort of geography of the self. For me, John Clare is significant in terms of this material because so much of his poetry and prose is concerned with the importance of place to identity. However, I think there's a sort of myth about Clare, that he was so attached to the village of Helpston, he had such a strong sense of the local, that whenever he moved away from Helpston, his identity sort of fragmented to the extent that he suffered severe mental illness. But I don't think we can simply say, well, that's because of sort of disruptions in terms of the geography of his life. I argue instead that Clare was always fascinated by the experience of being out of place and how that developed the self. And it's a simple point, really. It's when we're most outside our comfort zones that we start properly to define who we are. Thinking of my own life, when I moved from Bedfordshire to Sussex and Brighton to go to university as an undergraduate, I think it was when I was in what to me was quite a strange and odd place that I started to work out who I was or who I wanted to be. So for Clare, I think, he was very interested in that process of dislocation and what that does to the self. And I think he also had a sense of belonging to a wider national community. He wasn't just a writer of the local. I'm going to focus on his great and complex poem, The Flitting, which I think is of particular significance. And this lecture is going to offer a sustained analysis of the poem. But the idea of this analysis is it's going to help you to get to grips with some of Clare's other work as well. You'll see from the slide that I've given a few useful dates to get a sense of the contours of Clare's life. So the time that he was at Helpston, when he moved to Northbrook, when he went to the asylums and so on. He spent 25 years of his life in asylums. And the flitting is often used as evidence for the moment when Clare's identity started to go, in 1832 when he moved from Helpston to Northbrook, which was, I think, 3 miles up the road. But I think this reading's very simplistic, as I'll come on to. There's no doubt that Clare was very attached to Helpston, and he writes at length of how important the fields, the trees, the animals, the birds were to his identity. In 1809, when Clare was 16, an Enclosure Act applying to the village was approved by Parliament. Enclosure was a process by which open fields shared by the people of the village were closed off and made the property of landowners. The effects of enclosure are subject to debate by historians, and some might defend it on the grounds that it made agriculture more efficient. But certainly the loss of the common rights by peasants was very much resisted at the time, and probably did concentrate wealth more in the hands of the few. Clare's poetry often looks to an idyllic pre-enclosure Helpston and the open fields of his youth, which are now lost. So in that sense, even when he was living in Helpston in the 1810s and 20s, there was already a sense of loss and disruption that affected his identity. And also, I would add that I think for Clare, and there's lots of evidence for this in the autobiographical writings, the experience of being a reader and then being a writer was something that actually cut him off to some extent from the local community, when walking around the fields was generally seen as something you did as a part of your labour. Clare did it when he was composing poetry and so on, and that actually marked him off from other members of the community, made him seem a bit weird. So I think it'd be wrong to see Clare as someone who was sort of felt like an integral part of the community in his youth. In January 1832, when he was 39, he moved for various reasons to the village of Northbrook. Although this was only 3 miles from Helpston, it did lead to a sense of confusion. And on the slide you can see an extract from a letter to his publisher, John Taylor, from 1832. I have had some difficulties to leave the woods and heaths and favourite spots that have known me for so long, for the very molehills on the heath and the old trees in the hedges seem bidding me farewell. Clare does something which is quite typical of his writings here. He emphasises his connection to the local environment through personification, projecting his own dislocation and loss onto the natural world. So rather than him saying goodbye to the molehills or the trees, they're saying goodbye to him. And I think one thing that Clare often does in his writing is find ways of suggesting an interconnectedness between the human and the non-human, and that's an example of what I mean. The poem The Flitting, which was written shortly after the move to Northbrook, describes his sense of dislocation, but also seeks to find ways of dealing with it. Rather, therefore, than being a straightforward cry from Clare's heart, it's actually a very complex and very measured poem. So I'm going to focus a bit more on that poem and deal with the opening few stanzas in the next section. The feeling of strangeness is conveyed very eloquently in the opening stanzas of the Flitting. I've left my own old home of homes, green fields and every pleasant place. The summer like a stranger comes, I pause and hardly know her face. I miss the hazel's happy green, the bluebell's quiet hanging bloom, where envy's sneer was never seen, where staring malice never comes. Alone and in a stranger scene, far from spots my heart esteems, the sun e'en seems to lose its way, nor knows the quarter it is in. Here every tree is strange to me, all foreign things where'er I go. There's none where boyhood made a sweet, or clambered up to rob a crow. There's a lot to say about those lines. The first thing you might notice is a lack of punctuation. Clare generally didn't punctuate his writings. There might be different reasons for that. He had a little bit of formal education, but not that much of it. And I think it's not clear that he really knew how to punctuate very well. Also, there is evidence that he resisted punctuation and saw it as a sort of constraining, restrictive force on his writing. There's some evidence for that from the letters. When his poetry was published during his lifetime, a lot of it was punctuated by his editors. And this has led to a lot of recent controversy about how Clare should be presented to a modern audience. Should he be presented in the form of the original manuscripts, which were unpunctuated, or should he be punctuated in a sense to try and make him more accessible for contemporary readers? And there's a lot of critical debate about that. You might also notice the spelling. Clare's spelling is inconsistent, and often, even by the rather loose standards of the early 19th century, incorrect. So here we have the sun e'en seems to lose its way. He also often uses dialect words associated with Northamptonshire, and here we have swee for swing towards the end of the passage. So there's an important point there to make about the sort of poetry that Clare writes, the form, the language, if you like. And I'll say a bit more about that later in the podcast. In terms of the content, there's a very strong emphasis here, which I'm sure you've picked up on, strangeness. The summer like a stranger comes, alone and in a stranger scene. There's a sense that everything, to use Clare's word, is foreign, is different to him. There's a sort of failure of memory here, I think, or a difficulty of memory. So one of the things that his sort of local environment does is connect him to his past. He can look at a particular past, say, oh, well, there I clambered up to rob a crow of its eggs, or there I made a swing with my friends. In this new place, he doesn't have that. So this passage is about being dislocated in terms of place, but it's also about being dislocated in time as well, being cut off from the sources of memory. And we have here, I think, a sort of crisis of the self, and the crisis is figured mainly in terms of knowledge. He no longer knows his environment, and therefore he no longer knows himself. Now, if that's all there was to the flitting, it would be interesting, but it would be a rather one-dimensional poem, as I think it's sometimes portrayed. But it doesn't end like this. It goes on, in fact, to consider the relationship between one's environment and one's sense of place, and the sort of writing that Clare admires. Give me no high-flown fangled things, no haunty pomp in marching chime, where muses play on golden strings, and splendour passes for sublime, where cities stretch as far as fame, and fancy's straining eye can go, and piled until the sky for shame is stooping far away below. I love the verse that mild and bland breathes of green fields and open sky. I love the muse that in her hand bears wreaths of native poesy, who walks nor skips the pasture brook in scorn, but by the drinking horse leans o'er its little brig to look how far the sallows lean across. There are a few words in there that might need definition. Fangled in the first line. A fangle is a piece of foppery or finery. So in that first stanza, he's talking about, as it were, pompous, splendid writing, and particularly pompous, splendid poetry. And he's rejecting that sort of writing. When he refers to muses, a muse is a classical goddess associated with one of the creative arts. And the muses in this first stanza are playing on golden strings, so there's a sense of richness, of opulence to their creativity. In the first stanza, he's talking about writing that strains to be splendid, strains to be impressive, fancy's straining eye. By fancy, he means something like the imagination or creativity there. The other stanza gives a different account of what writing might be. Verse, poetry that mild and bland. By bland, he means something like gentle. Bland has rather negative connotations for us, meaning sort of boring or insipid. But for Clare, it's a good thing here. It's something that's mild and gentle. It's a sort of archaic or at least a rarely used word in the time for poetry. But there's a sort of pun on it, isn't there? A posy is a collection of flowers. So he's making the connection again between a certain sort of writing and a closeness to the natural world. And you see that in the final few lines. And again, this is an extended simile, by which I mean he's using the muse to embody what this sort of poetry might do, and suggesting by the way she walks around what this poetry might be interested in. So this muse, unlike the muse in the other stanza, is interested in everyday life, is interested in the pasture brook, quite an insignificant piece of water, looks over the little bridge and is interested in how far the willows, the sallows, lean across the brook. So she's interested in the sort of what might seem rather insignificant details of everyday life. And yet for Clare, these were absolutely crucial. These are what made great poetry, not splendour or cities or golden strings. What this does, this section of the poem, it allows him, by the end of the poem, to imagine the landscape around Northbrook, which has seemed all sort of very strange at the beginning of the poem, to actually be something rather familiar. It's no longer conceived as foreign. The foreignness, the strangeness, is, as it were, deflected onto the pomposity of a certain sort of writing and a certain sort of human culture associated with marble cities. And the last couple of lines of the poem are, "Still the grass eternal springs, where castles stood and grandeur died." So he's setting castles and grandeur and the sort of pompous writing as he sees it associated with them, with, on the other hand, a very lowly form of nature, grass, and the mild and bland native poesy that deals with that aspect of the natural world. I'll talk more about the conclusion in a little bit. So, the last section of this podcast is going to think more about Clare's phrase, native poesy, because I think it's through that phrase and through meditating on that phrase that Clare is able to move the self beyond its initial sense of dislocation. Native means two things in this context. It means naturally occurring, native as natural, and it also means native as in terms of particular origins. So if you're a native to a place, you come from that particular place. You were probably born in that place. Earlier in the poem, he talks about the pleasure of his native fields surrounding Helpston. When he uses native there, he's referring to somewhere where he was born, a very specific part of the geography of his poem. But here I think he means something much broader. Native poesy doesn't just refer to Helpston and the parish surrounding it. Because as the poem continues, he accepts this new environment of Northbrook, a different parish, a different place. And he's reminded of and connected to his past in Helpston as he views the weeds that surround his new home. I think weeds are really important to Clare. Clare really identifies with weeds. And I suppose weeds are the things that we don't want to think about, we want to tidy up, we want to get rid of, we want to cut down. And yet, for Clare, they're an important part of the beauty of the natural world. And I think perhaps there are times in his life where he might have felt rather insignificant, or rather people wanted to prune him and prune his work. And I think in that sense he identified with the weeds. So what we have in the flitting, I think, is a recognition that an intense localism, an obsession with a particular place as the only source of your identity, is insufficient. And Clare calls it, in fact, a feeling that ill becomes a man. There's something rather childish about that attachment, which isn't to say it isn't powerful, but it's something that might be resisted and dealt with. And you see that in this passage, I think. E'en here my simple feelings nurse, a love for every simple weed, and e'en this little shepherd's purse grieves me to cut it up. Indeed, I had at times a love and joy for every weed and everything, a feeling kindred from a boy, a feeling brought with every spring. And why? This little shepherd's purse that grows in this strange spot in days gone by, grew in the little garden rose on that old hut now left. And I feel what I never felt before, this weed an ancient neighbour here, and though I own the spot not more, its every trifle makes it dear. So the shepherd's purse is a particular type of weed, if you like, and it's a very insignificant thing in one sense, but Clare's interested in what is apparently insignificant, because actually it has a palpable and strong effect in this passage. He thinks about the shepherd's purse, the same species, if you like, that existed in his home parish of Helpston. And weirdly that connects him up to his past place, while also reconciling him with this new place. The weed, an ancient neighbour. This word neighbour, I think, is quite important because it gives a sense of being, if you know your neighbours, if you're relaxed with your neighbours, you have a sense of place, you have a sense of home. I'd also point out the use of caesura in those lines. A caesura is a pause within a line of poetry. If you look at the fourth line of the second stanza, that caesura is doing a lot of work. On that old hut now left, he sort of built up, and then there's a pause, and then there's the conclusion to what he's been talking about before then. This sense of neighbourliness and this sense of connection to the past, well, I think a sort of reconciliation with the present. So, however confusedly, I think, the flitting presents a possibility of a wider sense of community, but beyond one's individual sense of native origins, which seems to be based at least partly on a love of the natural world, a sense of interconnectedness, and going along with that, an understanding of native poesy, this verse that mild and bland breathes of green fields. The critic John Lucas has quite interestingly, I think, read The Flitting as a political poem, rather than just a poem about the poetry of nature. He focuses in particular on the final two stanzas, which I'll read now. And again, Clare's back to the subject of weeds. The ivy at the parlour end, the woodbine at the garden gate, are all and each affection's friend, that renders parting desolate. But times will change, and friends must part, and nature still can make amends. Their memory lingers round the heart, like life whose essence is its friends. Time looks on pomp with careless moods, or killing apathy's disdain. So where old marble cities stood, poor persecuted weeds remain. She feels a love for little things, that very few can feel besides, and still the grass eternal springs, where castles stood and grandeur died. So weeds again as an important example of the beauty and the most insignificant details of the natural world. There is a sense of attachment to place in these lines, but also I think an acceptance of change. Times will change and friends must part. There's an emphasis here on the importance of memory, which is allowed through this evocation of weeds. And if you remember back to the opening of the poem, The Flitting, that's about a failure of memory. Memory seems to be somehow recovered here. In the final stanza of the poem, and the second stanza on the slide, Clare's argument shifts to emphasising the triumph of the natural world over man-made things. Time or history will always defeat marble cities, will always defeat pomp and splendour, because they eventually will collapse and only the natural world will endure. This is an argument about the triumph of the natural world over human culture, I think, but it's also an argument about the superiority over native poesy, that verse mild and bland, and then the poetry or the writing that deals with pomp and splendour and city life, if you like. I think the issue of nature enduring is quite an interesting one here, because thinking about environmental theory and environmental criticism, a lot of people have written about Clare as a sort of proto-environmentalist, of a poet who's very concerned with the relationship between humanity and the natural world. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think he's more interested in the details of the natural world than perhaps any other poet I can think of from the Romantic period. And you only need to read his poems on birds to realise that. But often environmentalism, I think even now, is about saving nature or saving the planet. And of course that's a bit misleading, isn't it? Because ultimately nature, the earth, will survive in some form for probably quite a lot longer than the human race will. Which isn't to say that humanity can't do lots of things to the planet and make lots of changes to its ecosystem. But nonetheless, there is a sense, I think, in Clare's writing and perhaps in this poetry of the insignificance of humanity in the great scheme of things. Just to go back to John Lucas and his argument about the politics of this poem, he suggests that the final lines of The Flitting refer to the idea that to the owners of England, its people are weeds or grass. And he's suggesting that the grass at the end of the poem is a sort of invading army representing an act of reclamation of the land and reclamation of the country. I mean, I'm not quite sure about that reading. I think there's some truth to it, but I think it also works against arguments that Lucas and other critics have made about Clare's localism, his lack of a sense of Englishness. If Lucas is right about The Flitting, then Clare is referring at the end to a national community of oppressed plebeians. After all, it wasn't just Helpston that was affected by the enclosure movement. It affected all different parts of Britain. The triumph of insignificant weeds, then, is not simply peculiar to Clare's native spot. For we've seen how weeds can be found in Northbrook and Helpston and everywhere else, and they connect these different places. The Flitting, then, is a poem about loss, and it is a poem about the self and place. But it's also a poem about escaping from self-pity, I think, through identification with a wider community that includes the natural world, the world of weeds and so on, but also, I think, the rural working classes, which in practice Clare may have felt slightly distanced from due to his literary activities. By imagining himself in this poem as a weed, transplanted from his native spot, but still producing native poesy, Clare is able to move away from the troubled self of the early parts of The Flitting to something like a celebration of community.